got our next talk, Taylor Krusen from Redockley. He spent time in Seattle, before that Portland, and before that Colorado. Is enjoying working with APIs for the public. Has spent his passion and his enthusiasm for making developer documentation engaging and dynamic. And a lot of his talk today will be focusing on that. Give it up, everyone, for Taylor Krusen.
Hello, everybody. I am very excited to be up here, and it has taken me a ridiculous amount of time to try and edit down what I would like to talk about to pull out the specific narrative. And I've done a fair amount of public speaking, and this is the first time that I have had way too much to say. So, topic I'm very interested in and excited to share with all of you, which is how to use and think about interactive elements inside of your documentation. My name is Taylor. I'm from Seattle. That is me. You can tell from the documentation arms. And my career journey was fairly atypical, like I imagine a lot of ours are. I had a non-technical background, went to a coding boot camp. When I got into tech in 2017, I went straight into developer relations for a company called Smartsheet. So I was helping people use their API, which is a cloud-based project management tool. Went from there to Dropbox, File Sync and Share API, transitioned to Dropbox Sign, which is an e-signature tool they had acquired, and they had a developer tool. They had a developer product. They had an e-signature API that developers would pay to use. So that was a big transition. And eventually moved from the marketing team onto the API engineering team to do a big documentation rebuild. And went from there to a company called Frontegg, authentication platform, and I'm now at Redockley. So I've spent the past 3 years or so of my career working on docs and plan to continue in that space. So, but contextual, the context is relevant here for kind of what we're going to be talking about, and I will, if I'm moving through something a bit too quickly, feel free to come and ask me about it later. I've got a lot to get through, so I might be skipping a couple pieces. But documentation, the modern web has evolved and changed a lot over the past recent years, and with it, so has documentation. It has gone from being something that is static to being something that is dynamic, and people have, developers in particular over that time, have been conditioned to interact with it, and so, pardon me. People consuming the information that we are writing are no longer just reading it, they're interacting with it. That has become the standard of what they are expecting to find when they are looking for information about your technical product. And thankfully, due to some of the new technologies that have become available recently, we have extensible syntax, and as writers, we have also become extensible. We can learn these cool new things, we can add new things to our documentation. And that's important because technical writing is a lot more than just words. Yes, we're writing things that people are going to be learning from, but we have a lot of different pieces that we need to incorporate in that to be able to teach them something. We might have images, we have code snippets, videos, all manner of things that we might be integrating into what we are creating in order for people to learn from. And it's important that we think about it that way, so that we're able to teach them more effectively. Most of my experience working in technical content has been around public APIs. So I have done the bulk of my writing always in Markdown. And I understand that lots of folks are still doing technical writing using a lot of other tools that I have not had much exposure to. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is very centers around Markdown. So just a little preface there. Don't try and scrutinize the samples too closely here. There's nothing super, like anywhere that I have syntax that I'm trying to call out, I will highlight with some different shapes and that kind of thing. There's nothing small that you will need to read and think about kind of throughout this. So on the left side, we have the Markdoc syntax that we are writing, where we're using these symbols to format the text that is being rendered on the page on the right side. You might recognize some of the syntax that you see here on the left. We have hyperlinks, we have things like images, we have subheadings, and down here we have a nice code snippet. And we just saw what rendered on the page, so we have all these different elements, and users might be interacting with them. And so it's important for us to think about not just the words that we're putting on the page, but the actual experience that our end users are having. Are these things that we are adding as part of what we're writing, something that are helping them learn or helping them engage with what we are trying to teach them? So with some of those elements on there, a little bit of extra thought going into what you're doing with them can make them much more useful for the people that are using them. So for hyperlinks, for example, you want to make sure that they are descriptive, so people know that they're clicking something, know what they're going to expect there. If you do have to put a straight string for a link onto a page, make sure it's something that's short and readable, doesn't have a bunch of query string parameters on the end. When you're using images that you're including in what you're creating, make sure that you have great alt text. Not everyone who needs to know what's in the image is going to be able to even see it. So you want to make sure that you are being thoughtful and deliberate about what's going on, what's going in there. You want to make sure you're adding file names that are useful. It's not a good experience when you download one and you have a really long string and no idea what is actually going to be in that image. When you're using subheadings in your writing, there's value that they add visually, creating structure and that kind of thing on your page. But people are also often copying them as anchor links. Someone on the API support team might be grabbing the troubleshooting section from something you wrote to send to someone in a support ticket. You want to make sure that they are descriptive, you don't want to make them too long, and you want to make sure that there's some context there for people to know what to expect for the content in that section. And so now we're going to talk about code and content. Haha, but it's just content that you're writing on the page, psych. So when you are adding code inside of your content, we're still just in regular Markdown land, you have to assume that whatever that code is, someone is going to grab as is and then try and execute where you're writing it. So please don't put a symbol for the terminal inside of your code sample, because someone will inevitably copy it and paste it and try and execute it. And while that is annoying for someone who's familiar with CLI tools, for someone who's not, that otherwise might have executed that sample, they can't. And they have an error that they don't know how to debug or do anything with. So it really, it's a small thing, but has a big impact on the end user. Similarly, if you have a series of commands that you need someone to use or execute, you want to make sure that those are together in one step or in separate snippets that are on your page. If they're lumped together like this, again, you're going to have that same issue. Annoying for some, blockers for others. For my next one, code blocks, I don't have a rendered picture here, which would have been more useful to you, so you will have to do with my words instead. Similar idea to your code snippets. People are going to grab what you put there, they're going to paste it in their IDE, and they're going to run it as is. So keep your output from the command you're running out of the same example, unless you really need it there for some reason. If you are going to add comments to the code sample, maybe keep them small, provide context for things that they might need to see with the code, but leave the longer descriptions, leave the steps, all of that in the body of the page. Anticipate that they're going to copy it over somewhere, and then try and execute it as it sits. Yeah, generally speaking, you want to try and keep your samples small and focused, and then leave the teaching to the words that you also have on the page. Another thing that you want to consider when you're working with your code in your docs, how people are interacting with them. So they might be copying them, they might be clicking a button to report a broken code sample or to send feedback from the page. So in general, many of you may already be writing in Markdown. This may be familiar territory for most of you. But it is less about any one element or how to use that element better, and more about thinking through what that end user's experience is going to be like, trying to use that, whatever the thing is, in your writing. Because that is where some of the more complex use cases start to, because that is a theme that you will need to carry over into some of the more complex elements, such as using code and content. Once again, I gotcha. We have code and content. And this one, actually, we don't even have to bring in any new libraries to use. Many of the modern Markdown parsers support HTML tags directly in our content. So here we have an iframe. We may have just copied this from a YouTube video and then put it in our Markdown to share that with people learning from our content. And inside of our Markdown, inside of our HTML tag, we have a whole bunch of different attributes here that control what is being rendered inside of our Markdown. So once again, you don't have to know what all of these are. I have no idea and will never bother to learn. But if you change them, it's going to change what it means for people to interact with that element when it renders on your page. Maybe you don't want to have picture-in-picture or whatever these other things do. But that type of thinking is very important to carry over into the other areas when you do start to add more complex elements. Another good example of an HTML tag, code and content you already have access to, is progressive disclosures. There's an HTML native progressive disclosure tag that is supported by all modern browsers, that is accessible out of the box. You use a details tag to wrap some Markdown content, add a summary, and you end up with a progressive disclosure over on the left side. So you want to make sure that you are setting expectations with what is there. You're expecting users to interact with that element. So you need to tell them, click this. This is what you will find here. So when a user clicks that progressive disclosure, it's going to expand and reveal the content inside of it. There's some implications to that. You, as the author, want to make sure that you're not putting content inside of that is critical for them to see in the context of the rest of the page. The goal of progressive disclosure isn't to have people engage with it and find some critical information there as some sort of hidden surprise. It should be to abstract out supplementary information so that your core article can remain more focused. People reading your article should be able to skip that completely if it's not relevant to them and get everything they need without ever opening it. But if someone comes along and they've never heard of YAML syntax, then they have a little place they can go to click, and yes, I want to go learn more about this because it will help me consume the rest of the content. So again, it's good to think about these things from a lens of what will the experience for your end user be. Now we're actually going to talk about code and content. I bet you're uncertain though. I could have another one queued up. No, we're going to talk about code and content first. Why do we need to bring code into our content, into what we are writing? Well, the reason is that as writers, our needs have evolved along with the same way that documentation has. The users who are consuming that knowledge have been conditioned to interact with it. And depending on what the product is, depending on what the knowledge is, that looks very different. We generally, this last bullet is doubly true for me because I'm talking to people learning about all kinds of fascinating new use cases around consuming knowledge that I've never even had to think about. So documentation and what we have to document and teach people is inherently complex. So we need better tools in order to meet that. We need more control, we need more flexibility to meet those use cases to teach a broader range of people. And we need tools that actually empower writers to meet those more complex use cases that we can use to capture and share knowledge that is more accurate and do it in a way that requires less effort. Well, maybe not less effort, but so when it's done well, blending code and content is something that can create a better experience for your end users that are trying to consume that knowledge. So a good example, and one of the reasons why many of the folks learning from resources related to public APIs is a lot of the places they go to learn, like the official React documentation, are interactive. If I go to the React docs, I have a live sandbox implementation of what I'm learning about in the API reference and the learning section. And let's see if it'll restart it. And if I make a change, then I can see it dynamically re-render. I can tinker with the implementation as I'm learning about it. And what that does is it takes something that is otherwise abstract and it makes it concrete. It gives you something to anchor to as you're trying to learn new information. So that is a resource, the React docs, that I have personally used. So it's something that impacted my own knowledge and kind of my learning journey. I have another one to share here that is also something that I have learned from, which is an educator named Josh Como. Has two courses that I have that I've gone through. One was CSS for JavaScript developers. The other was The Joy of React, and both of them are created using some of the technology we're going to talk about today, MDX, which combines Markdown with JSX, and really, really fascinating, just interactive experience all the way through with all kinds of interactive things to play with and see and touch and learn about and toggle. This particular example is from his blog, and it is an interactive guide to Flexbox. So as you're learning about Flexbox and it's explaining these concepts to you, you get many things along the way that you can see and drag and drop and change and see what happens and changes on the page. And this type of thing is, while it's simple, anchors your provides context around the knowledge that you're learning and takes it off of the page and makes it something real. And this next example comes from being more on the teaching side of things rather than learning. So this was the first opportunity I'd had to kind of embrace that paradigm for others to consume and learn from. When I was at Dropbox Sign, we did a large documentation rebuild where we created an open API description for a broad and deep API that was based out of a large legacy code base. And then we created new documentation based on that open API description that that had a lot of amazing features baked in. And one of them is that you could send live calls from your API reference documentation. This tool is called Redocly. Here they're pretty cool. But the ability to send calls to these API endpoints where you're consuming the knowledge about what that looks like, what the data looks like inside of that object, and that functionality isn't only confined to the API reference docs. you can actually pull out the ability to send those calls and put it into your guides, the words that you're writing. The significance of that is you can contextually allow people to touch things as you're trying to teach them about that. Now, one of the things that was really interesting about that experience for me was I got to see firsthand the impact that could have on a business that is large and has lots of different organizations and people and different stakeholders in the documentation. And who benefited from that work and what that looked like was not what I expected kind of going into that project. And so this idea of having code inside of your content is something that is significant because it gives writers a lot more control over that end user experience. Code and content allows you to add custom, bespoke elements that facilitate that engagement. So we use Markdown syntax, but you can imagine if you could dream up any authoring tool and then use it in a repeatable fashion to allow people to interact with things. It's a pretty powerful paradigm. But there are trade-offs. You're adding complexity, which adds learning curve. You need to make sure that it works on all kinds of different browsers. There's a maintenance element. You now have code that's executing. What happens if the library updates? And you need to consider accessibility and what the experience is going to be like for your end user. And so now we're going to get into some of the actual tech. So first, we'll start with how Markdown works, because it's very important to know. You see, you write the syntax, and something renders on the page. Excellent. Now I will carefully explain how MDX and Markdoc work. Like this. You still have syntax you're writing on the page, but now we're adding React components to the magic. And that's, as writers, all that we need to know about what is happening under the hood. And that is because abstractions in general in tech are a very good thing. The ability to build on top of abstractions is one of the reasons why we have so many amazing tools to build with. It's because we are standing on the shoulders of giants when we are picking up what someone else has built and set down in order to build something else with it. I'm standing on someone's head here, not their shoulders, but that paradigm doesn't only apply to people building software, it applies to people writing it as well. And so, as we are looking at these new capabilities, these new ways of doing things in our docs, new syntax, new complexity, new code can be frightening, but it shouldn't be, because this is all that we need to care about, is the magic. We don't want to care about the implementation. We want to care about the content. And so one of the ways that code can make it into our content and our custom elements is through something called MDX, which is Markdown for the component era. It adds support for JSX inside of your Markdown, which is React code. You can learn more about it at the documentation. Syntax looks like this. We have our Markdown syntax. Inside of that, you will see a React component up here at the top. It's being imported. There's our pre-built element. Here it is being used. So similar to the HTML tag, we're just dropping it right in there. Our HTML still renders. We also get support for JavaScript expressions. So between these things, it means you have full control over what is happening when that Markdown page renders. You can write functions, you can add components, you can do pretty much anything on those pages. So very powerful. You can imagine if you had rudimentary logic to only display a banner ad that, hey, this feature is in beta, until it's no longer in beta, and then automatically won't display. All kinds of interesting implications around extensibility. Now, that being said, you would be writing the code to do that. So the examples I gave earlier for interactive tools that I had learned from were built using MDX. And then in mid-2022, a new tool was open source called Markdoc, which is described as a powerful Markdown-based authoring framework, which is delightfully vague, but it is a hard tool to describe in words that people will understand the same way. But what it does is it also extends Markdown with custom components, but it does so by adding support for custom Markdoc tags. You can see, you can learn more about it at some of these resources. But this is what the syntax looks like. So again, we have our Markdown syntax, our Markdown elements, and then here is our Markdown tag, or our Markdoc tag. It even kind of looks the same in terms of structure. We have these new nice little handlebar-esque curly braces, and we still get support for some other goodies as well, things like variables. There's also Markdoc functions to build your kind of rudimentary logic, which we won't cover here, but are an interesting one. Good example of something built with Markdoc comes from the people who built it, which is Stripe. And Stripe developed Markdoc because they wanted a lot of the power and capabilities of having code and content without delivered in a way that optimized the authoring experience of the people building with it. And so you may be wondering why there are two tools that do the same thing. And you may be wondering what the same thing is, which is using custom code inside of your Markdown content. And that's because they are built and designed to meet different needs. As I said, Stripe built Markdoc specifically around the authoring experience. And we can step through this example implementation real quick to compare syntax together. We're going to be creating this element using both. So we get the same rendered output from the MDX syntax on the left, importing the component, using the component. On the right, we have our Markdoc syntax, using this tag. In both cases, we have Markdown elements that are adjacent to it, that are inside of it. Now, if we change something inside of our tag or inside of our component in MDX, then we get a different rendered output. We changed, let's go back one, we changed info to warning here. Now, in MDX, what this does is it passes a different string to your React prop. And Markdoc, the author is changing the attribute. Now, the attribute is also eventually going to react to a React component as the form of a prop. But as the writer, we're interacting with the tag schema, not the React component, a very important distinction. Now, I had AI drum us up some sweet graphic here so I could make this clever analogy, and then I didn't care about the analogy anymore because I was so amused by how ridiculous the AI-generated images were that I decided to just leave them as is so we could all feel a nice, solid sense of job security. So that being said, Markdoc is not finger blocks, and MDX is not gibberish robot. But how to think about these two things is MDX has React components directly integrated in your Markdown. Markdoc enforces a very strict separation of concerns. And so when you're thinking about MDX, the entire file is being parsed and executed as code. With Markdoc, your docs, even with this new syntax in them, are just a source of data. So that data can be passed around, different rendering pipelines, stored somewhere. So quick example of kind of what that looks like as an author. If I am in MDX, and I know this is tiny and you can't see anything, but I am currently removing a prop from a component, and it has blown up because it is a required prop inside of my React component. So as a writer, that can be a very jarring experience. In Markdoc, if I have a required property that I then remove, I get this lovely message right here that says I am missing a required attribute. And rather than having an error message in a coding language that I may not be unfamiliar with, I get a response in the terminal from a Docs as code environment where I'm running something locally in my IDE already anyway. So while both tools unlock custom elements, MDX is something that makes things very extensible, it's very powerful, but Markdoc gives you much tighter control over the experience authors have writing with it. Now, if you would like to see what it actually means to optimize the authoring experience using tags, I have an on-conference session today at 1:15 and some tags where I'm going to be improving the validation on some things. So cool opportunity to see some of the implementations. I'm going to jump through some of these so I can share a couple things with you. So one is that in thinking about how to incorporate these in your writing, you should think about them as something that can enhance what it is you're trying to teach people. You don't want to add complication that's not necessary. As you're learning about some resources to kind of get you started in the right direction, you can start small. You don't have to instantly bring on new tools and tech that you're not familiar with or comfortable with. Use your Markdown. Use it for everything. Only reach for that custom element when you need it or when it adds value to your end user. Both of these tools have interactive playgrounds on their documentation. So you can tinker with the elements, see what renders, see what happens when it breaks. So that's a good way to go explore without having to set it up yourself. If you're ready to build with them, then a lot of tools have MDX baked into it already, and some have Markdoc. So Astro has support for Markdoc. Redocly may have support for Markdoc soon. Moving on. Code and content is, in my opinion, the future of technical writing. And that is because being able to provide a better end user experience and help people learn about technical tools more effectively comes from providing a better authoring experience. It comes from empowering authors to be able to deliver that experience to end users while thinking there's magic wizards in the sky that deliver the capabilities without the complexity. And adding interactivity and user engagement into our docs gives us something that we can track, that we can see and measure and communicate about. And that's important because it helps us turn documentation into a product. It helps us communicate with other stakeholder teams about something that they don't see or understand or want to invest in. But suddenly we have visibility into that user's behavior with our product as they were learning about something that we were trying to teach them. And so you should write the docs. You shouldn't write or understand the code unless you want to, and then go do that. But don't let any level of technical knowledge deter you from using these tools, because demanding that they are easy enough for you to use without that technical knowledge is how this becomes something that people can actually use and succeed with and teach people about technical tools with. Thank you for coming.
Taylor Krusen, everyone. Thank you so much. We've got some time for Q&A, and we're going to bring out the chairs. As heavy as they look, they probably are from how we're doing it. Thank you so much, Janine. Have a seat. Welcome.
Ooh.
Again, Q&A. We've got in the top there. We'll have a couple questions to ask before our coffee break in just a moment. Taylor, thank you so much. As someone who's worked through Markdoc as well as MDX, it's always really exciting to see the kinds of things that you can do with code, and that there's always so much potential to make things really dynamic or really make modular or take on your own. So we're going to go through some Q&A here. We've got Anonymous here at 10:28 a.m. had asked, is there anything you found surprising about how users interact with any of the interactive elements that you've put in specifically, or it's just broadly speaking?
I think what surprised me the most was who was interacting with it. Bringing a technical product closer to the surface for more people to see and touch unlocks business value in really surprising ways, because although developers might be the people building with and implementing your product. Having a PM or a VP or a CTO that can go and reach out and touch the thing in 10 seconds, this is really, really impactful. So I think mostly surprised by who was interacting with it.
Yeah, and you can especially find a lot of value when it's maybe like a stakeholder or a decision maker, someone at a higher level making an immediate impact. Like, I love how this looks. We're going to incorporate that into our team. Next question we've got here. Markdoc syntax looks a lot like Liquid, and in terms of using that with Jekyll, is there any historical relationship between them, if you know?
I don't have as much background in the documentation space and have heard all kinds of syntax I am unfamiliar with, but I pretty much guarantee the answer to that is yes, because the folks who built it do have a lot of exposure to a lot of the different tech in the space for a long time, because Stripe is Stripe. And when you look at their docs, it's clearly something they've been investing in for a long time, long enough that they built Markdoc. And one little tidbit that I forgot to call out during my slide, but Stripe is often kind of lauded as this gold standard for documentation. And like, yes, like the tech is part of that, but I believe that it has less to do with the tech and the implementation and more to do with the fact that it makes it an outlet for everyone's collective expertise. So you have, like when you're looking at their docs, it's not just the writers, it's not just engineering, it is the collective brain power of sales, marketing, like all of these different organizations pointed in the right direction, embracing that as an outlet.
Yeah, and on top of that, with Markdoc being open source and really allowing other folks to take it and make it on their own, again, just really lowering the barrier of entry for folks. This question is really fun. It's one I like. What are your favorite interactive elements to add into content?
Ooh.
Yeah, a tough question.
Technical products take very different shapes, especially if they're around for a long time. So you can end up with something that's either like very broad, like with just tons of different features, or something where you have one or two endpoints that all the different features has been stuffed now, so you have like 50 different parameters, and depending on how you configure it is how you call these different features. So I really like the ability to to surface very specific features that are otherwise just surrounded in nuance and technical complexity that the people that care about the feature don't have the time to understand or digest or how to work with. So I really like the API interactivity and being able to drop that into what I'm trying to teach people. That being said, I think there's a lot of implications around other types of interactions that are also still valuable that don't look like public APIs. So like joining Redocly and working with different types of customers and different products and media and that kind of thing, I'm very excited to get to explore what that looks like more, like images, infographics, all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. We've got time for one more question. This one's a little spicy here.
Yes.
Dennis talked about so many links and feeling like that's the wrong page to be on.
Yes.
And then yours make content more interactive.
Yes.
In this question and answer, arm wrestle debate, there's no violence here, of course. So just defend.
I am so glad that this is the question I get to end on, because I approach this and look at these and see these things to me it's always like more interaction, like more stuff, like do that. 100% like my view and approach on it. When I joined Redocly, my manager very much comes from Dennis's school of thought around that, which is correct. And I, as an advocate and an evangelist, I see new tech opportunities and the possibilities there and get very excited about it. But at the end of the day, the goal is to teach someone about how to use something, and more engaging doesn't necessarily mean more effective. So for all that my observations and things are right, many of them are may not be. A great example here, me and my enthusiasm for these new wonderful interactive elements after joining Redocly is I really like tabs, like tabbed views, being able to put different information in these tabs and then flip through it. And so I would overuse the feature and quite a bit. And right after joining like Redocly, my manager is a keyboard-only user, and the tabs aren't accessible. You can't switch between them. And it's like, oh, so 80% of what I just wrote on this page, you can't access at all. And that was so far out of my field of thought at the time, and yeah. So I think staying rooted in the least, I think as minimal as possible on the interactivity that you are adding, so that when you are using it, it is very deliberate and it is something that is adding value and comprehension in a way that you would not otherwise have been able to reach.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taylor. Everyone, again, round of applause for Taylor.